Alright, so listen, this video is a remake of two posts I made on my Instagram. One of them was archived a few hours before it was posted, and the other one was still up until I archived it on the 14th of March. The one that was still up was posted in early October of the previous year, while the one that was archived was posted in early July. The archived one had way too many flaws, while the one that was still up also had flaws, but they weren't as glaring as the archived one. The reason I archived the one that was still up is because I'm making this video which combines the idea of both posts and revamps them in a manner I deem to be solid. I was planning on posting this video earlier, but life. Either way, within this video I plan to complete 3 objectives. The first of these objectives is to explain Shikai, Bankai, Hoe'd, Resurrección, and explain what a Zanpakuto is. The second is to answer to what degree the aforementioned transformations amplify the user's strength. The third and final objective is to answer whether or not the derived multipliers apply to speed. This video will be structured in a way so that I'll first cite numerous pieces of evidence before explaining how I interpret them. Before the video starts, I'd like to say something. Please start dropping essays in the comment sections of my videos. Like, if you disagree with me, make a video or a post and just tag me in it. Or you can just DM me on Instagram, we can set up a VC. But this essay dropping ain't it, because it puts me in a situation where I'm basically forced to respond and engage in a text debate in a comment section, because I'm not at the level where I can just ignore comments because I have too many of them. Thus, when someone drops an essay, people will be like, here's a debunk to your entire argument. And if I don't give a counter argument, it'll seem like I just had nothing to say to counter it, because it's obvious that I've seen it, because I'm not like some large YouTuber that has thousands of comments on every video. Like, it'll be obvious that I have seen the comment. It is not like I can make a video responding to every single comment someone makes, because that also just ain't it. There are times where I will respond to a comment with an argument, but most of the time I'll just ignore it or tell them to DM me on IG. But anyways, let me stop wasting time and get into it. On page 98 of the Soul's data book, it's stated that a Zanpakuto is usually shaped like a Japanese sword and can be used for fighting. Zanpakutos in their sealed state have a unique name, while the Zanpakuto of a seed officer is called Asauchi and doesn't have a specific name. In episode 230, it's explained that the shape and abilities of a Zanpakuto are based on the Soul Reaper's soul. It furthers by saying that Soul Reapers gain power by learning the name of their Zanpakuto and synergizing with them. It's also stated that Zanpakutos are born with Shinigami and they die with them. Take a look. Episode 231 is basically centered around the spirits that reside within one Zanpakuto. It would take way too much time to explain due to the pacing of the episode, with there not just being one instance that explains everything, so just watch this clip. If this clip doesn't prove to you that a Zanpakuto has an entity residing within it, then just watch the entire episode and it'll make sense. For anyone who has ever read or watched Bleach, this is like common knowledge. In chapter 49, Uryo states that Soul Reapers use the spiritual powers created from their souls alongside their Zanpakuto in order to fight against Hollows. In chapter 110, Zangetsu states that an Asauchi is a nameless Zanpakuto for Soul Reapers who aren't worthy of joining the Gotei 13. In chapter 523, it's explained that the Asauchi are the ultimate Zanpakuto as they can become anything. It claims that they are a nameless Zanpakuto issued to over 6,000 Gotei 13 members. It is given to them while they study in the academy before officially being assigned to them once they become an officer. It states that all Soul Reapers eat and sleep with their Asauchi while imprinting the essence of their soul onto it through endless training in order to create their own Zanpakuto. In the Mass Data book, it stated that an Arrancar's primary weapon is the same as a Soul Reaper's. But unlike the Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto, the blade is the embodiment of the Hollow's power. It then furthers by saying that an Arrancar Zanpakuto is characterized by its unique shape before release. The last piece of evidence I'll cite is that the word Zanpakuto translates to Soul Cutter Sword. Now let's begin explaining what all this means in order to answer the question at hand. Firstly, the term Zanpakuto is a classification of weapons wielded by Soul Reapers and Arrancars. For Soul Reapers, they begin as basic Japanese swords that are called Asauchi. However, by spending countless days with their Asauchi and training with it, the Soul Reaper will imprint their souls onto the blade, creating their own unique weapon. This imprinting of one soul creates what is called the Zanpakuto spirit, which is an entity that dwells within one Zanpakuto. By synergizing synergizing with one Zanpakuto spirit, one is able to draw power and gain special abilities. If a Soul Reaper dies, so will its Zanpakuto spirit, as they are the result of the Soul Reaper imprinting their souls into the Yasauchis. For arrancars, their Zanpakuto is the embodiment of their hollow powers and is characterized by its unique shape before they release it. The Zanpakutos are usually in a sealed state, which means that their special qualities aren't being used. I won't say anything else since it delves into the territory of the other questions or sections of this video, and this explanation should suffice for now. In chapter 127, it stated that the essence of Shikai is to communicate and synchronize with your Zanpakuto, while Bankai requires externalizing one Zanpakuto and forcing it into submission. It also implies that to achieve Shikai, you have to enter the inner world of your Zanpakuto to communicate with it, while to achieve Bankai, you have to do the opposite and bring it into the real world. In the Mass Data book, it stated that only a few Soul Reapers achieve the ability to release their Zanpakuto. It furthered by saying that the Zanpakuto of high-ranking seated officers have unique physical manifestation, and by releasing the power of the sword, its combat capability improves dramatically. Moreover, it states that there are two stages to a Zanpakuto release, which are called Shikai and Bankai. In chapter 208, Shalon explains that Bankai consumes an enormous amount of spiritual power, and it's difficult for even a captain to maintain Bankai active for a long period of time. Coupling this with the previous evidence I've cited alongside basic knowledge that you should already have by watching the series, it's safe to assert that Shikai is the first release of a Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto, and it is achieved by entering one Zanpakuto's inner world to communicate and synchronize with one Zanpakuto spirit. It allows them to draw on the strength of their Zanpakuto spirit while also gaining special abilities. As stated previously, the Zanpakuto of a Soul Reaper is normally in its sealed state, where it is usually shaped like a Japanese sword. However, once the Soul Reaper in question recites a release command, they release their Zanpakuto and activate their Shikai. On the other hand, Bankai is then the second and final release of a Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto, and it is achieved by antithetical means to Shikai. You see, to achieve Bankai, you must bring your Zanpakuto into the real world, which usually takes 10 years of training, and force it to submit to you. In Ichigo's case, it was defeating Zangetsu via selecting a specific sword, but it's unknown whether or not this is the only way of forcing your Zanpakuto spirit to submit to you. I don't know if it's ever explicitly stated, but Bankai serves two functions. The first is to allow the Soul Reaper in question to unlock extremely powerful abilities, while the second is to massively amplify their strength. Given Bankai amplifies one's strength by an immense amount, it requires a lot of spiritual pressure to both activate and maintain. Due to this, even those with large reserves of spiritual power will eventually tire out and be unable to maintain their Zanpakuto in its final release form. In chapter 120, Yoruichi states that in terms of a Zanpakuto strength, the difference between Shikai and Bankai can vary depending on the individual's innate talent and training. However, it is generally between 5 and 10 times greater. Bleach scalers are quick to just assume that every Bankai is a 10 times amp, while Bleach down players go for the lowest of a 5 times amp. However, something I haven't seen anyone mention is how Yoruichi states that the degree to which your Bankai amplifies your strength over your Shikai depends on your training and innate talents, but is generally between 5 and 10 times. The key word here is generally, as it tells us that there are outliers, things that deviate from the norm, which is 5 to 10 times. It also tells us that the multiplier isn't just a set 5 or 10 times amp, if not 5 to 10 times amp. This means that the multiplier for Bankai is generally 5, 6, 7, 8, and a 10 times amp, ignoring decimals of course. Thus, as a general rule, whenever a character uses Bankai, you cannot say that the amp is just 5-fold, since that would be a low bar. You also can't say that it's a 10-fold amp, since that's just the high end. I have the belief that you have to go with the mid end of 7.5 times. This allows you to be as close as possible to the true value when the innate talents and training of a specific character are unknown. Of course, in certain cases, you can argue that a character has shown above average innate talents, thus it's likely that their Bankai multiplier is closer to 10 times, such as in Ichigo's case. But this is just explaining Bankai's general application. It would take way too long and would be way too tedious to talk about every single character in the series that has Bankai and explain whether or not they classify as being above average. Shikai is a little tricky since there aren't any explicit statements about its amp, to my knowledge at least. Therefore, we have to begin deducing. Okay, so we know that the Soul Reapers gain powers and synergize with their Zanpakuto. Synergizing is defined as the act of combining or coordinating the activity of two or more agents to produce a joint effect greater than the sum of their separate effects. In chapter 120, when Ichigo fights Zangetsu, they seem to be at around the same level of strength. In chapter 117, Byakuya goes to release his Shikai while implying that he's about to massively amplify his strength before being stopped by Yoruichi. The reason we know this is his Shikai and not his Bankai is because of his stance he takes. With his Shikai, he holds the sword to his chest, but with his Bankai, he just drops it. Using these facts, it can be asserted that Shikai is more than a twofold amp, since the Soul Reaper and their Zanpakuto spirit should possess roughly the same level of strength. And given the Soul Reaper synergizes with their Zanpakuto spirit, it means that the amp will be greater than just 1 plus 1. Thus, Shikai's amp is greater than twofold. This is consistent with the scan I showed, which states that Zanpakuto releases dramatically amplifies one's strength. This means that when a Soul Reaper goes from their seal form to Bankai, their strength should actually be amplified by over 15 times. In chapter 258, Sirusi states, quote, "Recall our release, Resurrección, which allows an Arrancar to gain the original fighting powers of a Hollow," end quote. In chapter 204, Edra states, quote, "An Arrancar Zanpakuto is sealed with the core of his power inside his body," end quote. He furthered by saying, quote, "They're not like the swords you Soul Reapers wield, as when we release our Zanpakuto, we also release our true power and form," end quote. On page 131 of the Mass Data Book, Resurrección is defined as, quote, "Releasing the Hollow's original form and abilities embodied in the blade is called Resurrección. By releasing their swords, their human-like forms changes into a non-human-like form. It is said that their combat abilities increase by several fold," end quote. Based on these pieces of evidence, we can arrive at the following conclusion. For Arrancars, their Zanpakuto is the embodiment of their hollow powers, which are sealed away alongside their Zanpakuto within their bodies. Their Zanpakuto release is called Resurrección, and when they activate it, it allows them to regain their original hollow powers alongside an appearance that seems to be a fusion between their human-like and original hollow form. Given Resurrección is the Spanish word for resurrection, it stands to reason that its namesake is derived from the idea that an Arrancar's hollow form is being resurrected by the use of this ability, as it has died and been reborn as an Arrancar. Now we're on to a more contentious topic, and the way this will be structured is that I will first give my premise and explain why I believe it's justified, before attacking the multitude of counter arguments I know of. Should be simple enough, right? Okay, so I believe that if you're going to quantify an amp for Resurrección, you can only assert it being unquantifiably above threefold. My reason for this being is that on page 131 of the Mass Data Book, which I have previously cited, it said that Resurrección amps the Arrancar in question by several fold. According to Oxford Languages, several is more than 2 but not many. This means that at the bare minimum, several will have to be equivalent to 3. The reason it wouldn't be like 2.1 or 2.5 is that the word is being used as a quantifier for real world objects, i.e. they denote natural numbers. What this means is that if I said that person over there is walking several dogs, you wouldn't think I'm talking about them walking 2 dogs while dragging the head of another dog. That's just not how it works. Another example would be saying that I have several apples. You wouldn't refer to 2 whole apples and a half-eaten apple as I have several apples. Solidifying this is the fact that using fold as a suffix is defined by Oxford Languages as forming adjectives and adverbs from cardinal numbers in an amount multiplied by. Given cardinal numbers are a generalized natural number used to measure the size of sets, they cannot be fractions or decimals. For example, the set of any number will be represented by a whole number. You wouldn't represent a set by a decimal because it goes against the definition of a set's cardinality or size. Anyways, back to the topic at hand. What I believe supports the notion of Resurrección being unquantifiably above a threefold amp is that in chapter 207, a bunch of fracciones were bodying Renji, Rangiku, and Toshiro. But the one I'll focus on is Toshiro, who fought Xiaolong. An unscathed Xiaolong states that he is unimpressed by Toshiro's Bankai release. In this scene, Toshiro is bleeding, which implied that he was damaged by Xiaolong. In the next chapter, chapter 208, we see Xiaolong easily contend with Toshiro. With this, we can easily assert that base Xiaolong is stronger than Bankai Toshiro to an unquantifiable degree. Xiaolong then activates his Resurrección, which now massively amplifies the power difference between himself and Toshiro. However, in chapter 209, Toshiro and company release Gentei Kaiju, which is basically a seal that restricts 80% of their spiritual powers. This means that Toshiro would have gotten exactly 5 times stronger than he previously was. Following this, Toshiro spooks and one-shots Xiaolong. I don't feel like I have to explicitly say it, but I will anyways. The 5 times amp was great enough to not only outshine Resurrección, but this was a Resurrección stack on top of another power difference. To summarize, here's the scaling chains. Resurrección being a threefold amp makes this scaling line make sense alongside being congruent with the data book statement. Now we'll talk about the counter arguments to my argument. The first is a statement made by Urahara in chapter 552, where he straight up says that Resurrección's amp is equal to that of Bankai, which should be a direct refutation to my argument, right? Well, ignoring how this statement is contradicted, there's actually another explanation. You see, this statement is a translation error, which is very understandable due to what I'm about to explain. Okay, so when you translate the text from the raw scan, the translation can change based on where you ended off and how you space out the words. For example, if you line up all the words without spacing, you'll get an inaccurate translation because the machine will think that it's just all one or two sentences rather than multiple sentences. On the other hand, if you space it out too much, the machine will think that there are more sentences than there actually are, which will also yield an inaccurate translation. Both of these methods make it seem as if Urahara is saying the amp Resurrección gives is on par with Bankai. However, the Google Lens translation and other translations say something similar but different. Ignoring the incoherent parts that are birthed through certain words, which are also present in the previous translations, this translation makes it appear as if Urahara is saying that Resurrección is merely similar in nature to Bankai in terms of how it functions, rather than its amp being equal. So why is this happening? Why are there two different translations of the same phrase? Well, it's quite simple. The reason this happens is because words can have multiple different meanings. This is why contextualization matters. In this case, the word or words that are fundamentally changing the meaning of what Urahara is saying are doshitsu, which means that something is the same quality, is similar in nature to, is homogeneous, or is comparable to something else. So the question is, which translation is correct? Is it the one saying that Resurrección is the same amp as Bankai, or is it the one saying that Resurrección is merely similar in nature to Bankai? Well, while I know people will disagree, allow me to explain why I believe it's the latter. First, let's contextualize the situation. Basically, Urahara is trying to figure out how the captains can regain their Zanpakuto spirit, which will allow them to regain their Bankai. In his theorizing, he questions why the Quincy are taking the Soul Reaper's Bankai but not the Resurrección of the Arrancar. He explains the basics of what Resurrección is and how it works before concluding that if a Quincy can take the Soul Reaper's Bankai, then they can surely take an Arrancar Resurrección, but they aren't taking it. This leads Urahara to two hypotheses. The first is that the Quincy cannot stay Resurrección, and the other is that they can, but it would be disadvantageous for them to do so. Kurotsuchi then responds by saying it must be the latter, as based on Urahara's research of the Arrancar's Resurrección, he couldn't find a reason as to why a Soul Reaper's Bankai could be stolen, but not an Arrancar's Resurrección. With this in mind, let me ask you a question. Which makes more sense in this context? That Urahara just randomly throws out Resurrección's multiplier, or that he is saying that due to these abilities being similar in nature, there shouldn't be any reason for the Quincy to be unable to steal an Arrancar Resurrección. I believe the latter makes far more sense, since the whole reason this conversation is even happening is that they're trying to figure out why the Quincy aren't stealing the Arrancar Resurrección. While Urahara was researching the hollows, he found out how Resurrección works. Thus, him mentioning it being similar to Bankai in terms of how it works makes sense to both trying to solve the problem at hand and simplifying it to Kurotsuchi by using Bankai as a form of comparison. On top of this, it would have made more sense for him to mention its amp in the bottom part of the panel, since that's where he goes into refuting the notion that the Quincy are disinterested in the Arrancar Resurrección. Moreover, for him to be able to arrive at the conclusion that if his Quincy can steal Bankai, then they can steal Resurrección as well, the inner workings of both abilities would have to be similar to assert that, otherwise it's a non sequitur. Like he goes, Resurrección works this way, so if they are able to steal Bankai, they can also steal Resurrección. That's a non sequitur unless Bankai works in a manner that is similar to that of Resurrección. We know it does, and so does Urahara. Thus, mentioning it there makes his line of reasoning valid without the need for elaboration if his premises are correct. Thus, the interpretation that he said Resurrección is similar to Bankai in terms of functionality solves the problem at hand while also making his line of reasoning consistent. While the interpretation that he was saying that Bankai and Resurrección have the same amp requires further elaboration for his line of reasoning to be consistent, and it doesn't make sense unless that elaboration is introduced. As a final nail in the coffin, if you use the furigana, which is basically the small symbols that appear next to or on top of kanji that help with pronunciation, you get the following text. Paraphrasing it yields the following. On top of this, There's a specific character between dimensions of Resurrección giving the user great strength, and it being similar or almost the same as Bankai. And while that character has a multitude of translations, the only one that seems to make sense here is and, making it impossible for Urahara to be stating that Resurrección and Bankai have similar amps. Something else I wanted to mention is that even if we were to assume that Urahara was truly comparing Resurrección's multiplier to that of Bankai, it still wouldn't disprove my argument, since he specifically says almost. This is significant because we know that Bankai's multiplier generally fluctuates between 5 and 10 times. Thus, if Resurrección was a 3 times multiplier, then saying it's almost the same amp as Bankai, or that its amp is approximating that of Bankai, would make sense, since 3 is close to 5. Thus, to summarize, while both translations make sense, I believe the interpretation that Urahara was saying that Resurrección is similar in nature to Bankai is more solid. My reasoning for this is that it just makes more sense when contextualized, and when you look at the small symbols on top of the Japanese letter, this translation is more consistent. Moreover, there's a specific character whose only translations can be and in this context, which makes the other interpretation highly unlikely. Randomly throwing its multiplier in there doesn't make as much sense as my interpretation, and would have made more sense if he said that afterwards as a supporting motive on why the Quincy would be interested in Resurrección. Coupling this with the fact that we've seen a 5 times multiplier be greater than Resurrección on 3 different occasions, I believe this interpretation is more plausible, as I've already iterated. The next contention to my argument would be that saying that Resurrección doesn't have a fixed amp. The argument goes like this. Resurrección is an ability where the user releases their original hollow powers and form which was sealed within themselves. Given that there's no reason to believe that there's a set amp on the degree to which an arrancar's power is sealed, you cannot logically assert that a quantified amp is a limit. To exemplify this, let's say that when an arrancar's original powers are sealed, it's usually a 66.66666% of their power, which is like 2/3 of their power. However, this isn't definitive, and they can choose to seal up to 99% of their original powers. This would mean that when some arrancars activate their Resurrección, their powers will be amplified 3-fold. However, when others activate their Resurrección, it will be amplified by 100-fold. There are 3 instances or arguments supporting this notion. The first is in chapter 247, where Ulquiorra is able to blitz Ichigo from 86 meters away, which implies that when Ulquiorra activated his Resurrección, he became 86 times faster, which should somewhat correlate to his Resurrección being more than a 3 times amp to his base form. The second is in chapter 205, where while when Ikkaku initially activated his Bankai he could damage Edrad, his Zanpakuto took damage after clashing with Edrad. You can say that his Bankai gives him a massive amount of strength, even beyond that of the base 5 to 10 times amp, as it stated that his Bankai is just a clump of energy. This is consistent with the theme of his Bankai, which is power. Thus you can argue that Resurrección's amp is at least 5-fold, but likely closer to 10-fold, because even after seeing his Bankai, Edrad implied that he was still stronger than Ikkaku. The final argument is the interpretation of the narrative of Resurrección, where it's meant to be the hollow counterpart of Bankai, in the same way the Espadas are the hollow counterpart of the Gotei 13, Las Noches is the hollow counterpart of the Seirei, etc. Moreover, this argument uses my own reasoning against me, since if we say that Urahara was comparing Resurrección and Bankai rather than saying their amps are the same, then the Resurrección of certain characters being above a 3-fold amp makes sense, as Bankai amps varies between a maximum and minimum, and with the notion of Resurrección being Bankai's narrative counterpart, the amp of some Resurrección would also be between 5 to 10 times. Okay, now it's time for me to give my counters to these arguments. Firstly, let's talk about the argument that states that Ulquiorra became 86 times faster after activating his Resurrección. The easiest way to counter this one is by saying that he himself didn't travel that distance, if not he used Sonido to do so. I have a few reasons for believing this. Firstly, on page 131 of the Max data book, it stated that Sonido is an arrancar's high-speed movement technique and is equivalent to the Soul Reaper's Shumpo, while also being around the same speed as it. While I don't think the way Shumpo functions is ever explained, I think with the depictions we have of it, we can get a pretty good idea of how it works. In chapter 117, we see Byakuya use Shumpo and disappear from Ichigo's vision. However, when Byakuya appears behind Ichigo, Ichigo is able to react to Byakuya's attack. In the next chapter, Byakuya and Yoruichi have a Shumpo standoff, where they both continuously use it in order to either get behind each other or dodge an attack from the other person. In the same chapter, Byakuya mentions that one of Yoruichi's Shunpo was slow, while Yoruichi claims that one of Byakuya's Shunpo was predictable. In chapter 140, Byakuya uses his Shunpo to get behind Renji. However, Renji reacts to it and claims that due to seeing Byakuya use that ability so much, he was able to foresee Byakuya's movement, which allowed him to finally avoid the attack. Around chapter 157, when Yoruichi and Soifon fight, both of them continuously use Shunpo to either get behind each other in attempts to attack the other person or to put some distance between each other. Take a look.
そうじゃな。そう思うのか、本当に。スズメバチ。小賀さん。
In chapter 200, Xiaolong uses Sonido to get behind Toshiro. In chapter 210, one of the Fracciones whose name I don't remember uses Sonido to appear behind Rangiku before attempting to strike her. Directly following that, Rangiku uses her Shunpo to get behind the Fraction and one-shots him. In chapter 211, Ichigo uses Shunpo to dodge an attack from Grimmjow and gets behind him. In chapter 280, Grimmjow uses Sonido and appears behind Ichigo in attempts to strike him. In that same chapter, he does the same thing again alongside using it to put some distance between himself and Ichigo. In chapter 299, Byakuya and Zomari use Shunpo and Sonido respectively multiple different times within this battle to both appear behind and in front of each other while trying to land a hit. At the end of episode 196 of Bleach, Byakuya and Zomari have a standoff where they use Shunpo and Sonido respectively to get behind each other. Take a look.
エスパーダ最速です。それはおごりだと言ったはずだ。おい、君らどこまで行くんや?
In chapter 240, Ulquiorra uses Sonido to get behind Ichigo and attempts to attack him. In chapter 250, Ichigo uses Sonido and appears behind Ulquiorra. With all of this in mind, we can conclude that both Sonido and Shunpo are abilities that allows the user to instantaneously accelerate to insane speeds in order to arrive at a specific location in a short period of time. This makes it appear as if they're teleporting even though they aren't. It appears to have limited range as it doesn't seem the user can use it to travel several kilometers at once. Its speed seems to scale to the user's base speed, as when Ichigo was fully hollowfighting his fight against Ulquiorra, he moved so fast that Ulquiorra couldn't pick him up with his sensory ability. Moreover, it wouldn't make sense for the Shunpo Soul Society art Ichigo uses to be the same speed as the Shunpo wielded by end of series Ichigo. Despite the massive amplification of speed given by this ability, many characters seem to be able to react to it. The reason for this can be attributed to the character in question either predicting the movement of the user, such as in Renji's case, or they are using Reikaku or Pesquisa to sense the moving spiritual pressure. The user of these high-speed movement abilities seems to be able to increase or decrease its speed. An example of this is Rangiku telling the Fraction that his Sonido was slow and he must come at her with his fastest Sonido. The user seems to get tunnel vision or are unable to visually perceive their surroundings as accurately as they can normally when using this ability. The reason I say this is because many times when this ability is used, the user appears behind their opposition before attempting to attack them rather than attacking them while this ability is in use. Their perceptive ability decreasing when using this ability would explain this seemingly illogical pattern between users of this ability, since it would be them trying to confuse their opponents while also understanding their position in space-time. It could also be that their perceptive ability cannot keep up with their speed, which is why they have low maneuverability. Another explanation could be that when they use the ability, they travel a predetermined path similar to projection sorcery from Jujutsu Kaisen. Appearing behind the opponent would make sense since it gives the user a better chance of landing a hit as opposed to attacking them head-on, since their opponent has to turn around to counter them when the opponent is behind them. Moreover, we know that when this ability is used, the user moves faster than their opponent can perceive, at least when the user and their opponent are around the same level of speed. This is evident as, in chapter 117, Ichigo implies that Byakuya disappeared from his vision, yet once he realized that Byakuya was using Shunpo, he was able to counter Byakuya's attack as he likely used Reikaku to pick up on his location. Shunpo and its variation seems to be similar to Bloodhound's step from Elden Ring, or Alucard's ability from Castlevania. With this overly extensive explanation out of the way, let's get back to the topic at hand. When Ulquiorra traveled those 86 meters, he immediately appeared in front of Ichigo before attacking him, rather than attacking him instantaneously with his near 100-fold speed difference. This is a pattern seen in many high-speed movement techniques, where they will appear near their user before attacking them rather than attacking them instantaneously. Why would Ulquiorra travel 86 times faster than Ichigo to appear in front of him, but slow down immensely in order to allow Ichigo to block the attack? I can see the response being because Ulquiorra was toying with Ichigo and wanted to show him the immense power difference between them. And while I can see this being true, it relies on the fact that Ulquiorra's stats were amplified near 100-fold, which would be one of the largest quantified amps in Bleach. And if we were to apply the Sagan standard, this claim is greater than just saying he used Sonido. Ulquiorra even states that if Ichigo didn't instinctively react, he would have died. Ulquiorra then goes on to use Zero Oscuras, which is supposed to be 10 times stronger than number 0, yet Ichigo survives it. If we assume Ichigo's Resurrección is truly near 100-fold amp, then Zero Oscuras should have been around 860 times stronger than Ichigo. For Ichigo to have survived this, Ulquiorra would have had to be restricting like 99% of his power, and even then the attack would have still been over 8 times stronger than Ichigo. On the other hand, if we were to say that Ulquiorra used Sonido, he would have had to restrict his strength by around 80% for the attack to have been 6 times stronger than Ichigo. While 80 and 99% may not seem to be that large of a difference, as a general rule, we should choose explanations whose claims are less extraordinary. Moreover, percentages scale to the value that is being used. This means that 50% of 10 isn't the same as 50% of 100, obviously. Thus, saying that Ulquiorra's Zero Oscuras is 30 times stronger than Ichigo is a lesser claim than saying it's hundreds of times stronger than Ichigo. To address the elephant in the room, Ulquiorra doesn't have those movement lines you usually see when someone is using these high-speed movement abilities. However, this can easily be explained by saying that when we saw Ulquiorra, this effect had already worn off, because this effect only appears while the user is still in motion or just arrived at that instant. This effect disappears very quickly following the use of the ability, so it's not a stretch to say that this is the case. It isn't as extraordinary of a claim as saying that Ulquiorra was suppressing like 99% of his hollow powers. Like, the datable entry states that Resurrección increases one power by several fold. I could see if it was like a 4 to 10 times amp, but an almost 100-fold amp is crazy, which solely relies on the fact that Ulquiorra moved 86 meters very quickly, which can easily be attributed to Sonido. Going back to what I said previously, there's actually examples of characters using these high-speed movement techniques and this effect not appearing. The one that comes to mind immediately is in chapter 117 and 118, where both Byakuya and Yoruichi use Shunpo and we do not see these effects. In conclusion, I believe saying that Ulquiorra was using Sonido in this scene is less extraordinary of a claim and requires fewer rationalizations than saying his Resurrección is at 86 times multiplier and sees up to 99% of his hollow powers or something near this value. Now we will move on to the second point, which is that Edrad was able to contend with Ikaku's Bankai, which shows that Resurrección is around the same level of strength as Bankai. The counter to this would be that you could interpret this scene as Ikaku's Bankai hardly even tripling his power upon initial release. Only after, quote-unquote, waking up, does it actually amplify his strength by 5 to 10 times, if not even greater. The reasoning behind this counter is that after clashing with Edrad, Ikaku states his Bankai was quote-unquote sleeping and needs some time to reach its full power. Thus, its strength after its initial release would be unknown, and you cannot assert it being a 5 to 10 times multiplier at this specific point. This interpretation is consistent with the fact that we've seen a confirmed 5 times amp for the Rise Resurrección this amp, while the other interpretation relies on the fact that there's a disparity between the degree one's Resurrección seals one's original hollow powers. I'm not saying that there isn't, as that would be a claim. I'm just saying that the other interpretation lies on this fact. The last counter argument I'll go over is the interpretation that Resurrección is a narrative counterpart to Bankai. The easiest way to counter this argument is by saying that all these narrative interpretations can be true and that Resurrección can still be at least a 3 times amp. The reason this is true is that Resurrección being the narrative counterpart of Bankai does not mean the degree to which they amplify the user's strength is the same. There's nothing suggesting that. It could easily be that the correlation is that both abilities drastically amplify the user's strength as someone becoming 3 times stronger is a drastic amplification in strength. Also, I have never denied the fact that there are certain Resurrección that have an amp that is greater than 3-fold, as that would be a claim as I stated previously. What I am saying and have been saying is that you have to present evidence to make the claim that there is. Even if you present evidence, it will just lead us to the fact that not all Resurrección amplify the user's strength equally, which will result in the fact that said hypothetical evidence will suggest that only the amp of that specific character will be equivalent or more than 3-fold, while for everyone else it will still be just 3-fold. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say about Resurrección. There's another argument that puts Resurrección's multiplier above 3-fold, but it lies on something concerning hoe'd, which is something I'll talk about in the next section, or the section that is coming up right now. This section will be concise because hoe'd has a clear definition and there aren't multiple concepts that need to be understood beforehand, aside from the basic concept you should already know, of course. On page 36 of the Mass Data book, hoe'd is explained by saying, quote, "By gaining the strength of a hollow, one's spiritual power increases dramatically. Only those that have control over their inner hollow can hoe'ify, which manifests itself as a unique mask of different shapes and designs." In chapter 535, Urahara explains hoe'd by saying, quote, "Hoe'd is an experimental process in which the soul of a hollow is injected into another soul, and then the boundary between these souls is destroyed, causing the target to evolve into a soul of a higher level. It was developed for the purpose of making a Shinigami soul stronger. However, controlling the process was beyond our capabilities." What you see here is the result of this uncontrollable procedure on the soul of a Quincy, which is not what it was developed for. When the symptoms of hoe'd progress, the soul in question enters a state in which the original soul and the hollow soul are intermingled, resulting in a mindless monster. And ultimately, it destroys not only the border between its component souls, but also the border between itself and the outside world. In other words, it destroys itself regardless of its own will. I call this phenomenon soul suicide." End quote. Urahara then says that he found a method to prevent soul suicide, and it is to inject something that directly opposes the hoe'd process into the soul of an infected person. He states that the destruction of the borders that is so key in the hoe'd process is brought about by destabilizing the soul's internal balance. This means that it is possible to reverse the hoe'd process by introducing an entity that opposes it and restores the soul's internal balance. I don't think I need to say anything else since it's pretty clear, but in simple terms, this means that by pouring the soul of a hollow into another soul and destroying the boundary between them, the non-hollow soul is able to don a unique hollow mask and massively amplify their strength, i.e. they are able to hoe'ify. However, this is when the hoe'd process is controlled, since it leads to a phenomenon known as soul suicide when this process isn't under control, which is a soul destroying itself. Hoe'd's multiplier is kind of weird, since there is no explicit statement of its strength and it doesn't seem like a consistent amp exists. I'll get into what I mean by that in a second, but one of the ways we can quantify its amp is by using the final fight between Ichigo and Grimmjow. In chapters 279 and 280, it is shown that Bankai Ichigo and base Grimmjow are around the same level of strength. In chapter 281, Ichigo hoe'ifys and Grimmjow activates his Resurrección. There is no noticeable gap in strength between the two as they continue to battle. This seems to imply that hoe'd's amp is around the same as that of Resurrección. Given that I've already established that Resurrección's multiplier should be at least 3-fold, hoe'd's multiplier should be the same. In chapter 383, Tozen basically tells Kumamura that his hoe'd amps his strength by a degree that it far exceeds that of Bankai. In chapter 385, Tozen reaffirms his stance by saying that a Bankai is quote-unquote measly. This seems to imply that hoe'd's amp is even greater than that of Bankai, which would put its multiplier at least 7.5 times, if not greater than 10 times. But if this is the case, then it implies that my quantification of Resurrección's multiplier would be wrong, as it was scaled to the multiplier of hoe'd due to the fight between Ichigo and Grimmjow. My counter to this argument is that due to the way hoe'd is defined, there is no set amp. Think about it for a second. It is stated that hoe'd amplifies the user's strength by basically adding the strength of a hollow on top of their own and breaking the boundary between their souls. This results in a dramatic increase in the strength of the user when they hoe'ify on top of that of the hollow's strength. Due to this, if you were to get a hollow with a power level of 100 and fuse it with someone that has a power level of 10, then when they hoe'ify, the increase in their power will exceed tenfold. On the other hand, if you were to get a hollow that has a power level of 10 and fuse it with someone that has a power level of 10 as well, then the power the user will gain when they hollowfy will be greater than twofold. The reason I say it's greater is that the explanation of hollowfication seems to imply that the mere fact of destroying the boundary between the souls of a hollow and another being results in an amplification of strength that is referred to as being quote-unquote dramatic irrespective of the hollow's strength. In other words, the amp of one's hollowfication can vary depending on the strength of one's inner hollow, but there's always a notable increase when one hollowfies, regardless of the strength of one's inner hollow. This means that if Tozen fused with a very strong hollow, then him implying that the strength he gained is greater than that of Bankai doesn't refute my argument. Elaborating on what I said previously, it should still be the case that there is a minimum degree to which your strength is amplified when you hollowfy, but the strength of your inner hollow can influence this to an unknown degree. For example, let's say you have a power level of 100 and your inner hollow has a power level of 100 as well. When you hollowfy, your power level will increase to 400 rather than 200. That is just an exemplification. It could also be that the amp is exponential. For example, rather than your inner hollow having a power level of 100, let's say it has a power level of 50, but when you hollowfy, your power level is amplified to 600. It's unknown how hollowfication exactly works, but we can assert that there's likely a minimum amp that is noticeable enough to be referred to as a dramatic amplification in strength. If I had to guess, I'd say that the minimum should be like twofold or something similar to it, but it's unknown. Moreover, the relationship between inner hollow strength and the resulting strength is also unknown, though you can make hypotheses. Something to point out is that at some point in the series, we're shown that Ichigo and his inner hollow are around the same level of strength when they battle in the hollow's inner world, with the resulting hollowfication being at least a threefold amp, as we saw in his battle with Grimmjow. Thus, maybe the influence on hollowfication's multiplier yielded from the difference in strength between the user and the hollow isn't that significant. Or maybe it is. It could be that after the hollow slightly surpasses the user in strength, there's an exponential increase in their hollowfication's multiplier, but it's ultimately unknown. Anyways, I'm dragging this section, so let's move on to the next one. The last question I'll be answering is whether or not the multipliers of the aforementioned transformations apply to speed. So let's get on with it because this video is taking way too long. I can't recall any examples of someone activating Shikai and their speed increasing or remaining the same. But as I explained in my video surrounding Bleach's energy system, the more spiritual pressure you have, the more your physical capabilities will be amplified. Due to this, those that are in the same realm of strength generally tend to be in the same realm of speed, with there not being these massive gaps in strength with minuscule gaps in speed. But put an asterisk on that. This means that, as a general rule, if your spiritual pressure increases, your strength will increase. If this increase to your strength is tenfold, then the increase in your speed shouldn't fall that far behind. It's not like your speed will just be amplified by 10%. Thus, if Shikai increases one's strength by twofold, then the degree by which one's speed is amplified shouldn't fall that far behind. However, let's put a pause on that for now since there is something else I'll point out which will put this notion into question. Anyways, let's move on. Bankai doesn't amplify one's speed since it's just stated that it amplifies one's strength rather than all of one's stat. Supporting this is that in chapter 161, Shikai Ichigo is able to keep up and react to Byakuya's Bankai for a short period despite the fact that base Byakuya was relative to him in speed. You even have chapter 205 where Edra straight up states that Ikaku's Bankai doesn't amplify his speed. If there's any evidence of Bankai increasing one's speed, someone drop the chapter or other source down in the comments below, cause I can't recall an example. Ignoring Ichigo of course because there is a valid explanation as to why his speed increases. For Resurrección, you have the mass data book stating that it amplifies one combat's capability by several-fold, which I've already explained is at least a threefold amp. Given speed should also be a combat capability, it stands to reason that it would be amplified by threefold. The problem with this is that it's contradicted numerous times. The first contradiction is the fact that you have base Ikaku and base Edrad being around the same level of speed, while Bankai Ikaku and Resurrección Edrad are seen to also be relative in speed despite the fact that it's stated that Ikaku's Bankai doesn't increase his speed. On top of this, when Edrad activates his Resurrección, he only talks about how his strength or power has increased rather than his physical capabilities as a whole. Moreover, Ikaku even reacts to Resurrección Edrad on multiple occasions. The second contradiction is that in chapter 208, Renji is able to intercept a Resurrección Il Fort despite the fact that in the previous chapter, this base il fort was clearly stronger, thus faster than Renji, because he was reacting to his attacks as well. There are more contradictions, but first let's talk about hoe'd. Given I've put into question the fact of whether or not Bankai and Resurrección inherently amplify their user's speed, I'll display two examples of hoe'd having around the same level of speed as these abilities. The first is in chapter 282, where Resurrección Grimmjow and hoe'd Bankai Ichigo are around the same level of strength and speed, despite the fact that Bankai Ichigo and base Grimmjow were on the same level. The second is in chapter 385, where hoe'd Tozen is tagged by Bankai Kumamura, despite the fact that in their base forms, they were basically on the same level of speed and strength. Something else to mention is that in chapter 384, when Tozen hits Kumamura, Kumamura doesn't comment on Tozen's speed, but rather his power. This doesn't imply that Tozen's speed didn't increase, but it does work as supporting evidence given everything I've previously mentioned. Something I'd like to remind y'all of is this statement made in chapter 208, which basically says that Bankai requires a lot of spiritual power to activate and maintain, and that after a long period of time, one will no longer be able to maintain it. We hardly ever see this effect since most fights don't take that long within the series itself or within the narrative itself. Either way, the reason I bring this up is to establish the following. While greater spiritual pressure tends to result in greater strength and speed, this isn't inherent, and there are instances where spiritual pressure can be amplified, but a specific stat may remain the same. In my video about Bleach's energy system, I explain the notions of spiritual pressure and spiritual power, or spiritual energy as it's sometimes called. I mentioned how spiritual power can be seen as an overall reserve of energy that is akin to stamina, while spiritual pressure represents an amount of spiritual power that is being used at any given period of time. For example, when you are running, you are constantly exerting energy to maintain your speed, but after a certain period, you get tired and begin to slow down. You were constantly exerting a fraction of the total amount of energy you had available to run at such a high speed, but after continuous use, you ran out of that energy, thus needed to recharge. Of course, human physiology is more complicated than this, but it's the idea that I want you to focus on. Based on this, the higher your spiritual power, the greater your spiritual pressure, thus the stronger and faster you become. However, when you increase your spiritual pressure without increasing your spiritual power, your stamina will decrease as you're drawing more energy from the same reserve, which is exactly why Bankai cannot be maintained for long. What I'm getting at is that just because your spiritual pressure has increased doesn't inherently mean that your speed has increased or that your spiritual power has increased. Thus, all the transformations mentioned in this video do not inherently amplify one's speed, as this notion is contradicted for every transformation mentioned except Shikai, to my knowledge at least. However, given everything I've mentioned, I doubt that Shikai also amplifies one's speed, but that's just doubt. I'd need to find an example to say for certain. Just know that it's questionable. Okay, now that I've said all of that, I'll ask for everyone's help. If you've read Bleach, cite an example where any of the transformations mentioned here amplifies one's speed, or give an argument as to why they would amplify one's speed. All I've done is explain why it's unlikely that they inherently amplify one's speed. However, I haven't claimed that they do not amplify speed at all. Since I can't recall an example of any of these transformations amplifying speed, I ask everyone who is watching this video to enlighten me. Don't mention Xiaolong or Ichigo since I've got explanations for them. One last thing, given the way hoe'd and Resurrección are defined, why wouldn't they amplify speed since they should amplify one's spiritual power? My brother in Christ, I have no idea, but the examples speak for themselves. For hoe'd, it may be the artificial nature of it results in only the amping strength and other stats that are not speed. For Resurrección, maybe they seal away all their other stats but not speed. I have no clue as to why, but the result is clear. Also, it's possible that these transformations do inherently amplify one's speed, but the degree to which is very minuscule. Either way, you cannot inherently use the strength multipliers for speed. Now that I've said everything I wanted to say, let's get into summarizing the conclusions I arrived at within this video. Firstly, what is a Zanpakuto? The term Zanpakuto is a classification of weapons wielded by Soul Reapers and Arrancars. For Soul Reapers, they begin as basic Japanese swords that are called asauchi. By spending countless time with their asauchi and training with it, Soul Reapers will imprint their soul into the blade, creating their own unique weapon. This imprinting of one's soul creates what is known as a Zanpakuto spirit, which is an entity that dwells within one's Zanpakuto. By synergizing with one's Zanpakuto spirit, one is able to draw power and gain special abilities. If a Soul Reaper dies, so will its Zanpakuto spirit, as they are the result of Soul Reapers imprinting their souls into Asauchis. For Arrancars, their Zanpakuto is the embodiment of their hollow powers and is characterized by its unique shape before they release it. For the vast majority of time, Zanpakutos are wielded in a sealed state, which means their special qualities aren't being used. Secondly, what is Shikai and Bankai? Shikai is the first release of a Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto and is achieved by entering the inner world of one's Zanpakuto spirit to communicate and synchronize with it. This allows them to draw on the strength of their Zanpakuto spirit while also gaining special abilities. As stated previously, the Zanpakuto of a Soul Reaper is normally in its sealed state, where it's usually shaped like a Japanese sword. However, once the Soul Reaper in question cites a release command, they release their Zanpakuto and activate their Shikai, which also changes the shape of their weapon. On the other hand, Bankai is then the second and final release of a Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto. It is achieved by antithetical means to Shikai, since to achieve Bankai, you must bring your Zanpakuto spirit into the real world, which usually takes 10 years of training, and force it to submit to you. In Ichigo's case, it was defeating Zangetsu via selecting a specific sword, but it's unknown whether or not this is the only way. Bankai serves two functions. The first is to allow the Soul Reaper in question to unlock extremely powerful abilities, while the second is to massively amplify one's strength. Activating and maintaining Bankai requires a massive amount of spiritual power, which is why even captains struggle to maintain it for extensive period. Thirdly, what is Shikai and Bankai's multiplier? Shikai should have a multiplier that is unquantifiably greater than 2-fold, while Bankai has a multiplier that can range between 5 and 10-fold. Thus the average is 7.5-fold. When someone goes from their sealed state to Bankai, their strength should be amplified by at least 15 times. Fourthly, what is Resurrección? Okay, so for Arrancars, their Zanpakuto is the embodiment of their hollow powers and is sealed away alongside their Zanpakuto within their bodies. When they release their Zanpakuto, they activate a form known as Resurrección, which allows them to regain their original hollow powers alongside an appearance that seems to be a fusion between their human-like and original hollow form. Given that Resurrección is the Spanish word for resurrection, it stands to reason that its namesake is derived from the idea that an Arrancar's hollow form is being resurrected by the use of this ability, as it has died and been reborn as an Arrancar. Fifthly, what is Resurrección's multiplier? Resurrección amplifies the strength of an Arrancar by at least 3-fold. Sixthly, what is Hoe'd? Hoe'd is a transformation that is attained by pouring in the soul of a hollow into another soul and destroying the boundary between both souls in order to gain immense strength. Seventhly, what is Hoe'd's multiplier? Hoe'd has no set multiplier, as it can vary depending on the strength of the hollow that is being used as a catalyst. However, it seems that the amp is inherently large enough to be called dramatic. Thus I propose that a 2-fold amp should suffice as a minimum. Based on what is known, Ichigo's Hollowfication is at least a 3-fold amp, while Tozen is at least a 5-fold amp, but is likely greater than 10-fold. Eighthly, do these multipliers apply to speed? These multipliers do not inherently apply to speed, since there are numerous examples of one's speed remaining the same following the use of these abilities. Whether this applies to Shikai is unknown to me, which is why I've asked anyone watching this video to list any example of one's speed being amplified following the use of any one of these abilities. Ichigo's Bankai and Xiaolong's Resurrección have their explanation, so don't mention them. And yeah, that's about it. Bye.